we begin the second part of our morning, and we have with us Professor Philip Burton, University of Birmingham, and who is a specialist of Latin versions of the Bible, and also of the Latin language by Augustine of Hippo. So there are two very important books about those topics, and a lot of articles, and we give to students, for example, we oblige students to study, for example, the Latin, the Christian Latin that is published in one of the companion, I think in the Oxford Companion of Latin. So it is a pleasure to give him the floor.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you to Professor Moller for, is this turned up? Bravo, okay, for the very kind invitation to this absolutely splendid conference. I begin with an observation from Peter Brown's 1971 classic study, The World of Late Antiquity. And alongside this anonymous portrait head from Ephesus, Brown adds a caption from Eunapius of Sardis's Life of the Philosophers from around AD 400, describing the 4th century philosopher Maximus of Ephesus, associate of the Emperor Julian. The very pupils of his eyes were winged. One could hardly endure the swift motion, oxykinesia, of his eyes. There's not a lot of motion in this paper, so I thought I'd mention that early on. There's a little bit of motion here. But this is largely to do with the transition between physical and metaphysical interpretations of bodily processes. I'd like to, I can just switch. For people watching online, we have the handout here, which I shall just scroll through. Good. I've added also, you see, a quotation from the English philosopher John Locke from 1690, his essay concerning human understanding. We should have a great many fewer disputes in the world, he says, if words were taken for what they are, the signs of our ideas, and not the things themselves. How about that share?
Share also.
Okay, so where are we going with all this? Where do we proceed? Well, first, I'd like to draw your attention to the Latin verb intueor, to look into, to contemplate. And by way of background, I'd like to talk about its distribution in the classical language. Then I want to move on to its use in biblical Latin, especially in the New Testament. I shall then go on to suggest that for various reasons, the biblical Latin translations tend to coalesce around this particular verb, intueor, and that from there, it goes on to become a sort of marker of Christian Latin identity. And thirdly, and this is the tendentious part, I shall consider whether, in adopting this word, Christian intellectuals also invent or formalize a whole new category of intellectual insight, what we might call intuition. And so far as I can see, most European languages at least have a similar word denoting a similar thing. So this isn't just an aspect of English lexicography. The overall arc of this process, which I hope will connect sufficiently with our themes of motion and posture, is a move from intueor representing a physical action, perhaps with almost magical but nonetheless essentially physical properties, to the noun intuitus, representing a more mental, spiritual, psychological process. So let's begin with some statistics. My argument rests on the presumption that intueor and related forms are particularly prominent in biblical Latin. Now, I give a summary table here based on the data on the Perseus Project Latin Word Study Tool. I confine myself here to texts of over 10,000 words in length in order to minimize the distorting effect of small samples. And a few immediate observations on the distribution in poetry. It seems to be an almost entirely unpoetical word in Latin. There's no examples in Lucretius Catullus, Virgil, Lucan, or Statius. the picture is slightly complicated by the existence of a third conjugation form, which I won't go into now, and just one each from Horace, Ovid, and Silius Italicus. Now, metrical convenience is likely to be a factor here. The first person forms intueor and intuear are easily admissible in dactylic verse, but most other forms contain the sequence long syllable, short syllable, long syllable, which you can't use in dactylic verse. However, there's the perfect participle intuitus, which is potentially very admissible. But in fact, this isn't attested before the Augustan period. We don't quite know whether the form is actually in use or just not used. It may have seemed to Virgil as something of a neologism. And I think there's an element of herd instinct here. If Virgil avoids the verb, then subsequent poets do so for that very reason. If you move on to prose writers, the distribution is much more messy. The data doesn't suggest a simple chronological arc. In Republican prose, we see one instance only in Caesar's Gallic War, which, of course, for Latin is very simple. In Cicero, the frequency is highest in his philosophical dialogues, so 2.2 per 10,000 words in the Tusculan Disputations, 2.7 De Republica, and relatively low in his letters, so 1.1 in letters to Quintus, 0.5 in letters to his friends, ad familiares, and just 0.08 in letters to Atticus, where his language is at absolutely its most familiar. Of course, semantics will have something to do with the distribution of these terms, but nonetheless, I think it's consistent with a situation in which this is essentially a literary, educated sort of word. If we turn to Livy, a generation later, we'll find that the highest distribution in the ones we looked at is in the early books, the first 10 books there, where you see we have this figure of 2.0. It goes down in later decades, and perhaps we can explain this with reference to the level there, because we're talking here about the legendary past of Rome, the foundation myths of Rome in the first 10 books, and the historical period in the later ones. In Imperial Latin, we find, if anything, an uptick in the frequency of the word, at least in some authors. Seneca the Younger likes it, you see, de era 3.5 per 10K. Quintilian, over 5.3 in a big corpus of text. A lot of these are in the set expression intuendum est, one must note this, that, or the other. The younger Pliny likes it as well. And this is all, I think, consistent with the interpretation I've proposed for Cicero. The word's essentially a genteelism, a word used by polite, educated people like us, partly, no doubt, to mark their linguistic status. The absence of reflexes of the verb in the Romance languages suggests its use in Latin declined in popular speech, to the point where it was confined to educated usage. And this, too, is important for us. And there's one big exception I want us to consider before we move on to biblical usage, and that's the first century, probably, writer Quintus Curtius Rufus. We're back here to Alexander the Great, of whom he wrote the big Latin work. And you see the frequency there is remarkably high, 6.9 per 10K, again, a large corpus of text, and a very significant number of examples there. And many of these examples are actually similar to things that we're going to find in Christian Latin. And of course, this is a work being written at much the same time as the Gospels were themselves. So let's consider a couple of them there. First one here, involving Alexander. Motus ergo rex constantia puri, Hephaestionem intuens, quam velem inquit, Darius aliquid ex hac indole halsisset. The king, moved by the boy's bravery, looking at Hephaestion, said, "How I wish Darius had received something of this nature." We have similar examples here involving his associate Polyperchon, and again involving the Dimnus, this potential pretender to the Macedonian throne. What the king, looking at him, intuens said, "What wrong have I done that Philotas should seem to you a worthier king of Macedon than I do?" And I suggest here we have the beginning of a pattern. Intuior is associated with a figure of authority, here Alexander, with a verb of looking expressed through a participle, which serves to introduce a saying of Alexander's addressed to a named individual through which Alexander's superior insight and general moral qualities emerge. I note also in passing that Alexander's eyes are important. I only found this out recently. Did we know Alexander's eyes were of different colour? Apparently they were. We have this on the authority of the Alexander romance. Plutarch's Life of Alexander simply has eyes of peculiar moistness, hugrotes, but people note Alexander's eyes as being important. Boethius, by the way, you see again another very high frequency. We'll come on to him before we're done. So, Intuitus and the Latin Bible. I turn now to my main claim today, which is that intuior and related themes come to enjoy particular prominence in the Latin Bible. This might seem at odds with the statistics if we move back again to where we were with the numbers. Vulgate Bible 1.2 per 10k, which is it's there or thereabouts. It's a pretty average sort of figure. But two factors I think mitigate against this. The first is the well-known one that Latin Bible translators don't, in general, aspire to a high literary style. We can exaggerate the level of vulgarism in biblical Latin, but undoubtedly it's not educated Mandarin prose such as the younger Pliny or the younger Seneca writes it. It's not the natural habitat for this verb. The other thing which heightens its salience in biblical Latin is the fact that it occurs in a number of well-known passages, which we may expect people to be familiar with. I give a number of examples here from the Old Latin traditions, and I won't go into the textual history of all of this here and now, partly because I don't really know it. But we have an example here from Tertullian, quoting 1 Corinthians there. We look not at the things that are visible, but at those which are invisible. Or from Ambrose of Milan discussing the Garden of Eden there, the woman saw that the wood was good to eat and pleasing to the eyes to see, and that it was delightful ad intuendum to contemplate. And similar examples, we can go through them. Job here, when his wife says, curse God and die. And he looks at her and says, thou speakest as one of the foolish women. And I apologize for that, but there you go. It's not me saying it. And again, Zechariah, famous proof text here, they shall look upon him whom they have pierced. And again, 1 Samuel, the Lord looketh on the heart there. See. So a whole set of these. And if we go into the Vulgate, a whole similar sequence, again, familiar passages. We have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah there. Abraham intuitus est Sodomam et Gomorrah. He looked at them. We have the star prophecy, Balaam's prophecy, Numbers 28. I shall look upon him, but not from close at hand. A star shall rise up from Jacob and a rod from Israel, etc. And here, one of my favorites for today, a double imperative, yea, revertere, revertere. So we may look upon you. So familiar passages all around. If we come on to the Vulgate, or the New Testament rather, we see a similar sort of situation emerging. I give you a set of examples there. Mark 6:41, feeding of the 5,000, and clearly a passage with Eucharistic overtones here. Jesus looks and he blesses and he breaks the bread and gives it to his disciples. Famous passage from Mark 10:21. Jesus looks at the rich young man and loves him and says to him, and go and sell what you have and give to the poor, etc. Intuitus est eum et dixit ei. Okay. The servant girl, a high priest servant in Luke 22 there, she sees Peter. Different Greek verb here, atinistor, here, favorite verb of Luke's. Eum puisset intuita, dixit. She said, you also were with that man. And the call of Simon Peter from John, yet another very famous example here. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of Jonah, you shall be called Cephas." So all of these are extraordinarily well-known passages, and they involve translating a range of different Greek verbs, usually compounds of blepo, but not always. We've seen also atenisto, we've seen skopeo as well. And we notice also the situation in which we typically find it. Jesus is behaving, or in some cases Paul, or in some cases Peter, is behaving much as Alexander the Great does. Looks at someone, into ends, often in a participle, often a specific named individual, and comes up with some sort of utterance which gives insight into their nature and a demonstration of the speaker's own sort of moral power. So from biblical Latin, I turn to the wider question of Christian usage in general. Some years ago, I considered a set of Latin words which I thought occurred more often in Christian writers than in non-Christian ones, despite the fact they had no obviously Christian content. And I did this by way of revisiting the Sondersprache, the special language hypothesis advanced by the Nijmegen scholars Schreinen and Moorman in the 20th century. And I suggested that these high-frequency words might be markers of Christian identity. And one of these was, in fact, intueo. I'll give you a brief sample of the statistics there. Not universal. Egeria there doesn't use it at all. She's very subliterary. But then if we look, for instance, at Augustine's Confessions, books 1 to 7, we have a frequency of 2.0 per 10K on 7 examples, which is, a fair number. The total for the corpus of Christian Latin texts I examined was 1.5 per 10K, as opposed to 1.0 per 10K for the Perseus prose texts in general. And if we look at the details of many of these usages, they look biblical. Here we have Sulpicius Severus discussing the activities of St. Martin of Tours. There's a healing here. Den der egram intuens, looking at the sick girl, he asked oil to be given to him, and when he had blessed it, he poured the sacred fluid into her mouth. Very much a sort of New Testament style scene here. Now, how do we explain this? And here I want to take it a little stage further to ask whether we're dealing with not just the rise of fortunes of particular words, but the birth of a whole new concept of intuition. And I take as a starting point, I take it as more or less axiomatic. There's a recognized grammar of looking at people, as we've seen in the Gospels and in Quintus Curtius. One element of this, I think, is going to be the popular notion, which is still with us, that the eye is an active organ. We all think of ourselves as having aties, a line of sight. And this is something which is formalized in the Hellenistic and classical world. There's a lot of theorizing about sight in the ancient world, and there's two main sorts: the extramission theory, which I've just mentioned, and the intramission theory, which is closer to modern ideas of sight entering our eyes. The notion of intuition that we find in the New Testament and elsewhere seems to me to owe something to the extramission idea of vision. So when Jesus looks at Peter, we understand this is an act of engagement. Jesus is sort of radiating a beam of sight. He's the initiator. Paul is the object. And this is something we find in Platonic and Stoic schools of thought in particular. And it's been put to me that when we're talking about the synoptic tradition, it's too early to talk about Platonic or Stoic influences. I think that's actually probably not the case. I feel I should say why first. Take the saying of Jesus here from Mark, so very early synoptic tradition. He said to them, Elijah does indeed come first to restore all things, apokatistane panta, a word which looks very much like the Stoic language of the apokatastasis, the renewal of the world there. Or another saying, also again from Mark and in Matthew, this saying of Jesus about the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, where Jesus is using parables not to speak wisdom to the simple, but rather to impose a difference between the esoterics who understand the mystery and the exoterics who may listen but not understand. And this is very similar to something we have in the Middle Platonic second letter of Plato. Almost the same, in fact. He that readeth may not understand. Ho anagnous me gnoer. So we have, I think, clear evidence for Stoic and Platonic ideas at an early stage in the synoptic tradition. So I move on now to later Christian writers. And I suggest that by the turn of the 5th century, we can see two important changes underway. The first is the arrival of the noun intuitus, corresponding to the verb. I should mention here that intuitio, the third declension form, isn't actually found in classical Latin at all. Intuitus is not securely attested before the 4th century. And when we do find it, we find it predominantly in Christian authors, very seldom outside, and very frequently among them. And I return here to my epigraph from John Locke. It's as if a term has been reified. The coinage of a word has led to the invention or the formalization of a new category of thought. The second important thing here, I think, is the intellectualization of this process. So Augustine, writing in the City of God of the book which is written in the Book of Revelation, in which the names of all the living are written, and he says we must understand that there to be a sort of divine power by which everyone's actions are surveyed with miraculous speed by our mental insight, mentis intuitu. Okay. Incidentally, intuere is not an easy verb to use in hexameter verse, but coincidentally, it's very easy to use, and intuitus is easy to use in the rhythmic patterns of late antique prose. I could talk about that if you want to. We find also, again, early 5th century, Arnobius Jr., talking about the need for typological analysis of the Hebrew scriptures. We need to look into these with the subtle lights of our mind, this mentalizing process again. Maximus of Turin explicitly contrasts physical insight, carnalis intuitu, with spiritual insight, spiritualis aspectu, that we see there. And in fact, Augustine refines this theory in his De Trinitate, possibly his masterpiece work, to solve, as he thinks, the other mind's problem of philosophy. Our physical senses cannot, we don't understand what people are experiencing as physical sensations, but we can all access through our intuitus the divine forms of things which exist in the mind of God, in the truth itself. These are the things which other people may look upon. And you can see this verb being used frequently to refer to truth itself rather than physical particulars. And I come now again back lastly to Boethius, who I mentioned is an absolute favorite user of this word. He absolutely loves it. The Consolation of Philosophy has many, many instances of this. We can see at the end, he turns his eyes to Philosophia when he first sees her. I saw the one who brought me up, at whose shrine I have been kept busy from my youth. Philosophy, clearly an abstraction here, something not seen physically. I was going to suggest that this is not entirely a rational process. I think actually there's a complex relationship between rational thinking about the world and intuitus as being a form of access to the truth, which is somewhere beyond my particular ken here. As a philologist, I'm aware I'm getting into philosophical territory, and this would require us also to ask how far we can actually, how far we discover and how far we invent categories of mental activity about this. Are these cultural constructions? Are these facts about the world? And in citing John Locke at the outset, I spoke carefully of the phenomenon of reification rather than the fallacy of reification. I want to keep that particular question open. Does the sort of abstraction embodied in the coinage of the noun intuitus necessarily represent something intellectually vicious? Are we conjuring into being something which doesn't actually exist? Is it merely a linguistic phenomenon? Or does it actually represent something which is new and or contribution to Western intellectual thought? Secondly, I'm aware my time is up, So I conclude by thanking Professor Moller again, thanking our host today, and thanking you all for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have now another specialist of old Latin version of the Bible, in particular the book of Hosea, and you are connected with the Biblical Institute, and so you will speak about moving the hands, the verb rapizo expalmo. I slept in the Vetus Latina between Africa and Europe. Thank you so much. Yeah.